I'm Anthony Freud, General Director of Lyric Opera of Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a thought-provoking conversation and a major highlight of this year's Chicago Humanities Festival. This program is generously underwritten by the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation, and this week's programs are presented with the support of Grace K. Stanek. Thank you for being with us today. If you're as passionate about opera as I am, chances are you've seen and heard most of the operas of Richard Wagner. His works are regularly presented by every major opera company in the world and are interpreted in an innumerable variety of ways, from the traditional and mythological to the political and ecological, via everything in between. Wagner wasn't always a substantial part of Chicago's operatic life. In the first half of the 20th century, his works played not second, but third fiddle to Italian and especially French repertoire, with just the occasional Walküre, Tristan, and Parsifal to appease the city's Wagner enthusiasts. Lyric Opera of Chicago, too, took some time in giving Wagner prominence on our stage. In the 1970s, things started to change, especially with a spectacular production of Tristan und Isolde and the 4 operas of The Ring. Eventually, we would produce all the mature works of Wagner, including, at long last, complete Ring cycles presented in 1996 and 2005. Our Wagner productions have always been highly successful, including the first 3 operas of our new production of The Ring. Götterdämmerung and complete cycles were scheduled to be produced in the spring of this year, but sadly, COVID-19 intervened and forced us to cancel them. I'm delighted to say that our programs for the current season include the Chicago premiere of Twilight Gods. This is an immersive work inspired by Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, to be performed in a parking garage. It will comprise several distinct installations, each its own self-contained designed world, populated by singers, actors, and small instrumental groups. The audience will be driving in their own cars from installation to installation, experiencing in abbreviated and reimagined form some of the essential themes of Wagner's great music drama: the decline and fall of a corrupt and decadent world, and the rebirth of a new world order. This radical reimagining has been conceived and is directed by Lyric's creative catalyst, Yuval Sharon. In recent years, we've been more aware than ever of Wagner as a polarizing figure. One of the great geniuses of Western art, who was also virulently anti-Semitic and whose politics veered erratically from one extreme to another. What is the relationship between an artist and his art? Can we abhor some of the things an artist stands for and adore the works he's produced? How should we interpret these works? To a greater degree than the works of any other composer, Wagner's music dramas demand to be viewed in multiple contexts, through the lenses of both the time of their creation, our own time, and the century and a half of their performance histories. Wagner is a figure of contradictions, both artistically and personally. As Alex Ross says in his new book, Wagner's misogyny, like his racism, can dissipate in the face of an unexplained force that erases distinctions and brings about transcendent unity. This force was music itself, the uncontrollable factor that foils any attempt to sum up what Wagner means, or indeed who he was. I can't imagine being in better hands for a discussion about Wagner than with our 2 very distinguished panelists. American music critic Alex Ross's book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, was published recently to enormous acclaim. He's the distinguished and long-standing music critic of The New Yorker. His New Yorker reviews have been highly influential, as have his books and commentaries on all manner of musical subjects and issues. Esa-Pekka Salonen is one of the world's great conductors and composers, widely regarded as a trailblazing musician of groundbreaking brilliance. He's music director of the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra and principal conductor and artistic advisor of London's Philharmonia Orchestra. His performances have included innumerable world premieres, and his own compositions are performed regularly by the world's leading orchestra and soloists. His commitment to restless innovation drives him constantly to reposition classical music in the 21st century. I'm delighted to welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival Alex Ross and Esa-Pekka Salonen.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for tuning into this discussion. The greatest thanks to Esa-Pekka Salonen for joining me from Hamburg for this discussion in and around above and beyond Wagner. And I'm sure many other topics will come up. But first, hello, it's very good to see you from a distance.
Hi back. Nice to see you again.
Yes, we last met actually for a discussion at the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles, touching on some of these same topics. It was just at the beginning of this year, but somehow it seems like 10 or 15 years ago, with this strange kind of distension and expansion of time that has taken place. But before getting into Wagner, maybe to sort of ask the obvious question, what have you been up to, and what has this strange time been like for you as a conductor and as a composer, and the sort of the different challenges, maybe opposite challenges that the isolation has meant for you?
To stay on the theme of German literature and the Holy Trinity of Schopenhauer, Wagner, and Nietzsche, this COVID 6 months or 7 months really feels like the magic mountain. You know, I feel like some kind of Hans Castorp who has lost the sense of time. So it could be 6 months, it could be 30 years, it could be anything. And I'm not alone with this, actually. Many colleagues and friends of mine, especially people who create new music and create new material, have felt the same, that somehow the fact that we seem to, all of a sudden, we seem to have all the time in the world in our hands, and we weren't as productive as we should have been. And I don't quite know why, but somehow to be in a time frame that is not defined, there's no end to it necessarily. I mean, we hope that there is an end to this exceptional time, but somehow every day during the lockdown seemed to be very much like the day before and the next day. So I lost the sense of a project. I was jotting things down, but they didn't seem to belong to any larger whole at all. It was just like a random thoughts, and this took me several months, and then finally I kind of bounced back, and I think my system got used to the new sense of time and new way of thinking, and finally I managed to compose some. And now, of course, in Europe we have cautiously started to perform live music again with live musicians on stage and live audience, not in a capacity house situation, but like maybe half the hall. So we're back in some kind of live performance situation, which is great. And of course, there's the rules and regulations change dynamically depending on the R number and so on. So at the moment, I'm in Hamburg, supposed to be conducting a couple of programs next week, if the situation stays stable. So I guess what is fundamentally different is that the kind of unreal way of planning ahead in classical music, especially in opera, we are discussing productions for 2024, 2025, and so on, and that was commonplace half a year ago. Now it's much harder to imagine that, and somehow the idea that we might do something next week or in 2 weeks' time that we couldn't imagine today is refreshing. So, good things and bad things. How about you?
Well, as someone who really just sort of sits at his desk all day long, there hasn't been as much change in my lifestyle as for other people. But of course, I've been almost completely unable to go to live concerts, which is what my entire life revolves around. So I've been sort of grasping at sort of other ways to write about the musical world, and I am very excited to be going very soon to the Götterdämmerung, adapted Götterdämmerung in Detroit, directed by Yuval Sharon. And it's funny that of all composers, the first major event that I'm going to see in terms of live music since March will be the most complicated, the most logistically demanding of all composers, Götterdämmerung. But there is a side to Wagner which is not monumental, which is sort of highly adaptable. And he's a composer who has been seen in so many guises, and not only sort of massive productions, but sort of smaller scale efforts, and of course excerpts from his music. And so maybe it's fitting, and of course also the decline, the twilight of the gods aspect might be apt for this moment. But yeah, let me ask about, so you have been in the middle of your first ring cycle in Finland, which I assume is experiencing delays and so on. But I was just wondering, how has that immersion affected your understanding of Wagner, and have you found yourself sort of coming to some new understanding of him, or is it just sort of a ongoing deepening of contact with him?
First of all, it has been all-consuming. This idea of conducting the ring cycle. Obviously I knew I had seen it. I had heard it. I knew what the dimensions are, and I kind of imagined what it takes to actually be in charge of all that. But I was wrong. I had no idea how massive it is. and also the fact that with Wagner, when you conduct it, there's almost never a static moment. By this I mean that, like in a classical symphony, or even in the Brahms symphony, or say Stravinsky or something like that, there are moments when the tempo remains static. It stays in one place. The orchestra is anchored to some kind of a basic pulse, and as a conductor you can kind of switch off a little bit, just to let your brain rest a tiny bit, like inhale, exhale kind of thing. But in Wagner this never happens, because it's always on its way somewhere. And even in the Rheingold, which is maybe the simplest of them, in some ways, it really, this is the case for 95% of the time, and that takes a completely different approach to how you learn the material, and how you rehearse it, and how you think of it. So it's been a massive discovery, kind of late in life, but I was trying to resist the call of Wagner for so many decades, but I couldn't finally. You know, Alex, I was thinking, what sets Wagner apart? I mean, there are so many things that do that, but in terms of, I was trying to compare him with other composers whose influence has gone way beyond the actual musical sphere, and you know, such as Beethoven, obviously, but also the sort of nationalist composers against their will, like Verdi and Sibelius and so on. So those composers had a huge impact in many ways, also politically, but the difference between them and Wagner seems to be that there are no multiple ways of interpretation of what that influence was, and that influence was pretty much local and kind of restricted to its time, and very specific. Whereas in the case of Wagner, his influence keeps changing. You know, the way he has affected not only fellow artists, but you know, the ways we see ourselves are so complex and ever-changing that this sets him apart. Was this your understanding always, or did you come to this conclusion during your research for the book, or do you disagree?
Yeah, no, it is different. And you know, that's the topic of the book really, is the singularity of this event in cultural history, where a composer who's really not a composer, he's a theater artist who writes his own music for his work, is really what Wagner was. The singularity that he sort of leapt far outside the musical realm, and became sort of almost a distinct movement in the wider culture, especially at the end of the 19th century. So this thing called Wagnerism, which is very difficult to define, but it was there, it's palpable, it's present everywhere, and it affected so many major figures in literature and the arts: Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Cézanne, Willa Cather, Virginia Woolf, Thomas Mann, George Eliot, Proust, goes on and on and on. And so just Wagner was something you sort of had to come to terms with. Even if you rejected Wagner, you sort of needed to have a stance. And yeah, this is different because somehow, you know, with Bach, with Beethoven, their presence, influence, especially within music, is enormous. Perhaps just in purely musical terms, you know, bigger than Wagner. Just if you have to look at how Bach, you know, has affected every epoch of music so profoundly. But they, you know, these figures seem to become settled at a certain point. You know, Bach is Bach, and you don't come upon people saying, well, I know Bach was a great composer, but there's something very troubling there. You know, and you don't hear people saying like, you know, I just refuse to listen to Beethoven. You know, it's or Stravinsky. You know, it's settled. These are big figures in history, and sort of everyone accepts them. Somehow Wagner is still not fully accepted, and there's still this resistance and this conflict around Wagner, which for me, just as a sort of part-time historian, is fascinating. Why is that? You know, why does Wagner remain so unsettling? And I think it's not just the political question and his anti-Semitism, because this tension existed really before all those issues came to the fore. Right from the start, Wagner was just sort of setting off this battle, you know, and so there's something in this music which just sets people on edge, and I guess it's both a power and a limitation or a problem, you know, that as you say, as a conductor, you know, it never, you know, even as you're going from moment to moment, is it sort of you need to be wary somehow that there's this kind of seething texture that you always need to keep an eye on? I mean, maybe it's sort of the same issue at work, just in terms of a kind of instability in the music.
But if you think of Beethoven's political influence, for instance, I think it's so closely connected with the ideals of Enlightenment. And of course, those ideals were the basis for the US Constitution and so on and so on. But we rarely see him outside that framework as a political influencer. And also, I mean, as I mentioned, Verdi and Sibelius. Verdi was a very useful tool in the unification process of Italy, and Sibelius, of course, was the sort of voice of the culture of a bilingual nation that was under the rule of another country, and so on. But Wagner, there's no particular theme under which we can put him. I mean, even during his lifetime, he changed camps so many times, and he was a revolutionary, declared criminal, and then later on he became the protege of the king of Bavaria, and you know, this journey from one extreme to another he made during his lifetime already. So I guess that part of the sort of unsettling quality may come from the fact that we don't even know where he was himself. Mm-hmm. So the field is wide open.
Yeah, that's.
But do you think there's like a hardcore Wagner, something that remained the same from the beginning to the end?
No, there wasn't. I think not certainly not in ideological terms, or even in aesthetic terms. I think there was always an instability. There's an element of chaos, irrationality, sort of anarchy in Wagner. Maybe those terms are slightly too negative. It's just this sensation of flux, which again you just describe, you know, as you experience the music as a conductor and sort of try to sort of keep hold of it. You said so beautifully, it's always going somewhere else. It's never sort of staying in place. It's always on the edge of some kind of sudden swerve and transformation. And so that's a quality that does make it extremely difficult to interpret. I think he is a figure that you can never nail down. And I think absolutely the origin of this explosion of competing interpretations of Wagner that I describe in the book do go back to him and his own contradictions, and how he just doesn't give clear signals as to what all this means. In combination with this, you know, there's this enormous visceral impact, and as you listen, you feel as though you're being seized by something very definite, very strong. But you actually there's a lack of really clear information as to what that is, what that force is, what the message is, and so I think that's the point at which you start projecting your own images, your own messages, and you sort of find yourself mirrored back at you more intensely.
And there are also moments when you feel that you have been manipulated emotionally, and that I felt that in almost all of his operas. There are moments when I feel, okay, he's manipulating me. He's taking me to a place where I don't necessarily want to go, but I have to because he's so very good at it. And that creates some degree of resentment also, that I thought maybe the wildly different reactions to his music might have to do with this, to some degree, that people kind of can't resist it. And if you can't resist something, then it becomes, of course, you can see it as an aggressive force or at least uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, like this happened to me when I saw the Dancer in the Dark by Lars von Trier. And at the end of the film, I was really angry because I felt that I had been emotionally manipulated. And for 10 days or so, I was kind of somehow out of whack. I was out of balance, off balance. And Wagner does the same. And it's not a coincidence that Lars von Trier loves Wagner, and and he used Tristan in one of his films, and so that's a so palpable quality in his music. And also, you think of Tristan, the overture, and you know the chaos it caused in the audience, where the ladies stopped breathing because the corsets were too tight all of a sudden, and they had to kind of the husbands had to start opening the corsets up to revive the ladies. And that's not random. That's not a coincidence. That is the work of a very skilled theater person, obviously, but also a manipulator. He knows what he's doing. It's not a coincidence.
Yeah, there's a whole series of incidents involving Tristan, especially, but sort of various other Wagner operas sort of having a physical effect on people. I think Chabrier passed out, fainted when he went to Bayreuth. Fontana had an attack of claustrophobia, a feeling of being stifled during the prelude to Parsifal, and had to leave the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, and someone else vomited, I think. So yeah, I mean, it is music that has a physical effect, and I think some people enjoy that. They enjoy this kind of extreme sort of roller coaster ride kind of sensation of just sort of the body itself being sort of wrenched this way and that, and other people reject it outright. And I think even those who do enjoy the sensation of being overwhelmed by the music also need to kind of reassert themselves after that powerful experience. And so they need to sort of take back their control. And I think that also explains some of these extreme, unexpected interpretations of Wagner, classically with Baudelaire, who said that he was just overpowered by Wagner and wrote him this extraordinary letter saying he'd been sort of invaded and penetrated by the music, and sort of these quite charged metaphors. But then he turns around and writes this interpretation of Wagner, which is absolutely wildly at variance with what Wagner himself seemed to have in mind. And he imposes this entirely French avant-garde, sort of proto-symbolist kind of interpretation on Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. And that's sort of the subsequent history, especially of that French Wagnerism, which is so interesting because it just seems to have so little to do with what Wagner had in mind. So yeah, so we need to fight back against the power of the music, and that's where the whole relationship becomes interesting, because like we have a right as spectators to make of this whatever we will. And this also is why I think Wagner has proved so productive for directors to impose their own visions, because somehow this music can withstand being ripped into sort of entirely new contexts. It just somehow seems to attach itself to any set of images, which is why Wagner has also been so powerful in Hollywood, because he can just sort of attach himself to anything. So it's just back and forth. On the one hand, he's very powerful, but we're powerful too as spectators. And that's sort of, in my book, I was trying to sort of get at that whole kind of spectrum, of responses.
In some cases, people were also ashamed of the effect Wagner had on them. Mm-hmm. And for instance, Stravinsky, of course, famously spent all of his life denying the influence of Wagner. Like every interview, every piece of writing, everything. And then there was the moment when the very early piece composed for the funeral of Rimsky-Korsakov, the Chant Funèbre, was discovered or rediscovered and reconstructed. And when I got the score, my first reaction was Parsifal. There were a few phrases that really jump out of the page. Right, that's Parsifal. And then I read Stravinsky's own description of the piece that he thought had been lost forever. So he could safely describe it in any way he wanted. And and he described it as a cortege where like all the various people come and pay their homage to Rimsky, and one after another, and of course the piece was nothing like that. It was like a ripoff from Parsifal. And, oh, sorry, that's my hotel room telephone. Sorry, I have to somehow mute it. Just a second.
You know, that's a fascinating point, and Stravinsky did go to Bayreuth, and he saw Parsifal in 1912, and you know, he later pretended, sort of made it out to seem as though he was disgusted by the whole experience, and undoubtedly he had problems with the whole atmosphere of Bayreuth. But I think the score itself affected him, and there's sort of bits and pieces of evidence from that period where Stravinsky was discussing Parsifal more respectfully and Wagner more respectfully. And so it's a classic kind of scene where, you know, especially a powerful creative figure like Stravinsky, and also like James Joyce, like Virginia Woolf, some of the other people I talk about in my book, T.S. Eliot, they often had these early powerful encounters with Wagner, and then as they matured and asserted themselves artistically, they needed to push Wagner at a distance. They needed to subdue this influence. And this is just a very common kind of relationship that comes about with creative figures. Harold Bloom talked about the anxiety of influence as kind of this denial or murder of the father, in a sense, this Oedipal scene. But that kind of relationship is especially pronounced with Wagner. And of course, Nietzsche is the first great case of that, where it's sort of just Wagner needs to, Nietzsche needs almost to kill Wagner to become himself. And that scene is played out again and again. And yeah, it seems to have happened with Stravinsky too, in some sense.
Also, if you think of, say, Pélase et Mélisande by Debussy, it really is some kind of a rite of passage for Debussy. He writes this piece that harks back to Parsifal again, in almost every way, apart from the harmonic language. But even harmonically, there are some moments that could be taken from Parsifal. But by and large, he's trying to distance himself from the chromatic world of late Wagner. But he has to write that piece as some kind of therapy almost. Once he's done with that, he's done, he's free, you know, and then his music becomes something else.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of late Debussy, that has very little to do with anything Wagner ever wrote. Also, it has very little to do with any other music.
Right. Yeah.
It occupies its own space. But I think many artists had to go through this kind of phase up until the Second World War, and after that, I think we have been less sort of stressed out by how we see Wagner. I think we may love it or we may hate it, but it's not the kind of fundamental thing we have to kind of make our minds up about.
Right. In musical terms, that is, of course, in terms of politics and ideology, that is sort of precisely the period at which the question of the problem of Wagner grows bigger and bigger. So sort of ironically, at the moment at which he's no longer such a contentious figure in aesthetic terms, there's sort of this growing antagonism in political terms, which I'm wondering, you know, for you, sort of, especially sort of in your early years, did all of that sort of color your attitude toward Wagner? I mean, you mentioned sort of this inclination to resist him at first, or to sort of not become a Wagner conductor, and sort of holding off from Wagner for a while, and now sort of stepping into the melee. Was that a factor for you as well?
I think I was mostly reacting to the text, the kind of floral quality of the librettos, and the words that seem to mean nothing, and the sort of very dense kind of poetry that seemed very, very old-fashioned and seemed to mean little. And like the opening of the Rheingold, you know, the sort of onomatopoetic squeals of the Rheintöchter, I found it really annoying and partly embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
However, I have changed my mind about that too. Because he had an idea of the music mostly already when he was writing the text, although the text obviously came before always, but he had some kind of a sense of where it was going. So that music needs that text, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And that one wonderful music could not exist or function without that particular kind of text. And also, I think the dramaturgical advantage of having a libretto that is almost impenetrable is that you can then really have the two layers at the same time. What is being said in terms of words on stage, and then the truth that comes from the pit, where we know that sometimes what people say on stage is not true.
Mm-hmm.
And the music tells us what it's really about. And I think, you know, if had the text being more precise, more less prone to interpretation, clearer, he would have lost that particular tool. So I think there's a purpose.
Right.
And of course, all German writers of that period, they played with the idea of reinventing the language, or they made up new words, and that was like a must. You know, it was like you were not a serious writer unless you created these monster words that nobody had ever said before. And Nietzsche was a prime example of that. And even now, when I walk the streets of Hamburg, and sometimes there's some kind of a government office or something like that, the title, the sign is like 3 meters long because this language allows you to put so many words together to
Right.
create another word. So it was not all his fault.
Yeah. But yeah, this is the power of vagueness. You're quite right. This lack of clarity and this sort of fogginess in terms of the language itself actually opens up this space for ambiguity and for sort of an exploration of a sort of in-between state. And it is all about the combination of words and music and the dramatic situation, because I really only finally understood what Wagner was all about when I saw the operas on stage. And I finally realized, oh, okay, you know, because, you know, even just sort of listening to recordings and following along with the librettos, I was still not getting it at all. And so sort of there's something which crystallizes, not just in terms of a visual image, not at all in terms of a visual image. It's sort of this kind of psychological atmosphere, the sort of state of tension existing between characters in a landscape, which is the combination of words, music, and, you know, the sort of this space, you know, this kind of vibrating, charged space that he creates. And yeah, any one of these elements is inadequate. I compare him, I think of him sometimes like Bob Dylan, where if you just sort of look at Bob Dylan's, you know, lyrics on the page, it's, you know, it's not quite Nobel Prize winning stuff, even though he did win the Nobel Prize. And then when you sort of take the music itself, it sort of lacks really kind of extraordinary sort of singular qualities. But when you put them together in conjunction with his voice and his manner, suddenly it's something completely charged with significance in a way that you can't expect. So perhaps an unexpected comparison, but I think of Wagner and Bob Dylan, and in terms of political influence as well, because Bob Dylan was such a huge political influence in the 1960s without necessarily intending to play this role of becoming the voice of a generation. But I won't go further with this perhaps questionable analogy. But I would like to pick up the political angle, because I'm sure this just comes up all the time for you and for me as well, presenting a book about Wagner, this question of, well, why do we still need to sort of deal with a figure who's so problematic, and how do we overcome the issue, especially of his anti-Semitism, in terms of staging the operas now and listening to the operas. And we discussed this at our Thomas Mann meeting earlier in the year, because Thomas Mann spent his whole life addressing that very question. But so what is your kind of immediate response to this question of why are we still even bothering with this often odious man?
Had he not written The Ring, it would be much easier to deal with his legacy, because The Ring, of course, became a very useful tool for the Nazis, for instance, because it really portrays different variations on the theme human on different levels. So there are the Nibelungen, and there are the gods, and there are the mortals, and it kind of sets out the idea that different races are of different value. And that was, of course, incredibly handy for Hitler and his gang. Without, and that's a very difficult structure to ignore when you put The Ring on stage. So what is the story? How do you justify showing these different levels of humanity, like as a value assessment? How do you justify showing that to the audience? And directors are struggling with this often. Of course, you could say the same thing about the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. It's like again, it's Wagner's fault in a way. That the Lord of the Rings is very clearly Wagnerian in its construction, and also Star Wars. It could be. It goes back to the same source. I think, one of the problems is that Wagner's life and his opinions are so very well documented, because he wrote so much himself, and so every time he opens his mouth, something horrible happens. And I was thinking, when we go far enough back in history, say we think of Aeschylus or Sophocles or something like that, we know virtually nothing about the lives of those men.
Or Shakespeare.
Very, very little. So all we have is the material they left behind, and so that separates the person from the content completely. So that problem doesn't exist. But with Wagner, I'm not trying to defend him. I find lots of his opinions completely unacceptable and vile. But had he been born 1,000 years earlier, we would not be having this conversation. Right. So it's that degree of documentation also.
Yeah.
but there's no clear, no simple answer to this. So where do we draw the limit?
You know, what I tend to think about, and it is, you know, absolutely true, say with Bach, for example, you know, for all we know, Bach was given to, you know, raging anti-Semitic monologues at the dinner table. You know, it would not be, you know, at all out of character for someone of his background to speak that way. If you just look at what Martin Luther wrote about Jews, some of the most disgusting anti-Semitic rhetoric in all of history. And there is this sense that, you know, anti-Semitism seeps into the text of Bach's works, some of the cantatas and the passions, because Jewish people are mentioned and in an unflattering context. And when you step way back from history, I think you realize that, you know, these problems are systemic. You know, racism and misogyny and this political sort of nationalist chauvinism are present all through artistic history at every stage. And Wagner is, for me, simply a more spectacular, more blatant case of this problem. And this is not to excuse him at all, because he did take a step, especially in writing Der Judentum in der Musik, his infamous anti-Semitic essay of 1850. He took a very particular step that other anti-Semitic artists did not do. But still, I don't necessarily see what's productive about singling Wagner out so severely and sort of making him out to be the bogeyman, you know, the Lucifer of artistic history, and that somehow if you sort of withdraw him from the scene, everything else is okay. You know, we've got rid of the bogeyman, and that's actually not at all the case. And sort of these problems persist, you know, all through, you know, our artistic history, and they're just always present. They're also present in our present, you know. And you mentioned Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings, and, you know, there is this, you know, the whole phenomenon of superheroes, this idea of these genetically superior beings are so popular nowadays, and there is a hierarchy at work there, which may prove to be very troubling, you know, especially for future historians. They may look back and see, you know, just problems endemic to our own time. So I think just a bit of balance is good when you're dealing with a figure like Wagner, and above all, understanding that we have the right to sort of remake this figure on our own terms and sort of enter into this relationship where we're reimagining him without forgetting, you know, the dark history at all, which I imagine is what goes on just every time Wagner is played. You know, some kind of transformation is taking place in the interpretation and the singing, in the direction as well.
And the question pops up every time, you know, why are you performing this, and what is the moral justification of presenting material by this vile man? And here we are coming back to the same problem that we talked about earlier. It's the power of his music. It's the sheer force by which it takes you, and it feels extra scary when we know that this person had opinions that should have never seen the daylight. So it's just that psychological and ethical conflict we feel, because we are ready to surrender. Our instincts tell us, okay, open yourself up and be ready to be taken to another far away place by this music. But we also know that there's a moral dilemma, there's a caveat in all this. So it's a conflict that is almost impossible to solve.
Yeah, but I think there's nothing wrong with, you know, I always feel a certain wariness and alertness when I listen to Wagner, just because I'm aware of all this history, and I'm also cautious in terms of that sheer intensity. But I think wariness and alertness, aren't negative qualities at all. There's something quite healthy about having that relationship as we're coming to terms with art, and not just having it be about an escape and sort of being kind of blissfully taken away into some pure, lovely realm. Art is in the world. Art is human, and just maybe Wagner is just more human, more kind of intensely human, both in terms of the brighter and the darker elements of his personality than most artists, because it's projected at you so strongly.
And also, there are elements in his art that are kind of unanimously wonderful, and that cannot be seen in any other way. That, like, things that are profoundly human and enlightened and touching. So when I think of Die Meistersinger, for instance, which when I was younger, that was like the last thing on earth I wanted to spend time with, like singing contest. So hello. And but now at this point in my life, I realized that it deals with a midlife crisis and how to solve it in an ethically worthy way. Because Hans Sachs realizes that he doesn't get the new stuff. He's too old. He's the ultimate Meistersinger, but the youngsters are doing modern music. It's avant-garde, and he has to kind of make up his mind in terms of where he stands. And also there's this romantic aspect that Eva at some point is of the opinion that she would become a very good wife to Hans Sachs. So he has to make decisions. He has to see himself for who he is and where he is in life and so on. So he makes a decision to support the new, which is the noblest decision, of course, for an aging Meistersinger. And I didn't get this until a few years ago. And there's a reason why I started to see it from that perspective. But that's universal. It's like it's the human condition thing that he so beautifully expresses in under 5 hours. So it's there are those elements that are beyond reproach.
Well, on that slightly more upbeat note, I think it's time to wrap up. But thank you so much, Espen, for this wonderful conversation. And I look forward, of course, to being back in the concert hall or opera house someday and hearing you at work, as well as future works which might emerge from your period of quarantine. But for now, goodbye and thanks so much.
Alex, let me say this. So congrats on your book. And it's going to be a groundbreaking publication. And it's going to change the discourse for decades. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the remainder of Chicago Humanities Festival.